He was shivering on my doorstep, alone. The first sound I heard that morning wasn't my alarm, or the birds outside, or the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. It was a tiny, broken sound, as if someone had tried to cry out and change their mind halfway through. A thin, hesitant meow slipped through the crack under my front door and curled into the hallway. So soft I almost thought I imagined it. I lay there in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, holding on to that sound the way you hold on to a fading dream. The world outside the curtains was still blue and colorless, the kind of cold early light that makes everything look distant and unreal. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself, or some bird, or... There it was again, a small, trembling mew, then silence. I pushed back the blanket and swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold under my feet, but my heart was beating strangely fast, as if it knew something I didn't yet. I didn't bother with slippers or a jacket. I padded down the hallway in my t-shirt and old sweatpants, the chill of the house wrapping around me like a second skin. The closer I came to the front door, the louder the silence felt. That tiny sound had left a wake behind it, an echo of worry that clung to the air. My hand found the deadbolt, turned it, then hesitated on the handle for a second. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I'd opened the door to an empty porch, a quiet street, the last traces of a dream. I opened the door. Cold air rushed in, sharp and wet, smelling of rain and asphalt and distant smoke. Dawn was still tangled in the clouds, turning everything a pale, grayish blue. The streetlights hummed softly. A few cars were parked crookedly along the curb, beads of rain on their windshields. The world looked like it was holding its breath. And there, just to the right of the doormat, curled up against the doorframe as if trying to disappear into it, was a small grey kitten. He was soaked. His fur clung to him in clumps, making him look even smaller than he already was. Little paws, thin as twigs. A tail wrapped tightly around his body like a shivering question mark. Droplets of water clung to his whiskers and eyelashes, trembling each time he breathed. He lifted his head when the door opened and looked up at me. I had never seen eyes that big on something so small. Golden, wide, filled with fear and something else I recognized with a jolt. Hope. The kind of desperate hope that hurts to look at because you know it's been disappointed too many times already. He tried to meow again, but only a hoarse croak came out, like his voice had been sanded down by too many cold nights and unanswered cries. He blinked slowly, fighting to keep those heavy eyes open as if he was afraid that if he closed them, I and the open door behind me might vanish. "Oh," I whispered. It wasn't a word so much as an exhale of feeling. I dropped to my knees on the threshold. The wooden boards of the porch were damp and cold, but I barely noticed. I extended my hand toward him, moving as slowly as if I were trying to reach into a memory. "Hey," I said softly. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The kitten flinched, just a small twitch, then stilled. For a heartbeat, he hovered between choices: run, hiss, freeze. Instead, he did something I wasn't prepared for. He inched closer. It was only half a step, but to him, it might as well have been a leap off a cliff. He leaned forward until his tiny, cold nose brushed my fingers. I could feel him trembling. Then, with the exhaustion of someone who had been brave for far too long, he rested his forehead against my hand. Something in my chest cracked open. "You're freezing," I said, my voice wobbling. His fur was icy and soaked through. When I slid my hand under his fragile body to lift him, I felt every rib, every sharp angle of bone. He weighed almost nothing. His paws scrabbled weakly against my wrist for a second, then relaxed as I drew him up and pressed him gently against my chest. He smelled like rain and dust and fear. I held him close, trying to shield him from the cold wind slithering into the house, and nudged the door shut with my shoulder. The click of the latch sounded strangely final, as if I'd closed something behind us that couldn't be reopened. "It's okay," I whispered again, because it felt like maybe he needed to hear it more than once. "You're safe now." The kitten gave the faintest rumbling sound, a ghost of a purr, and tucked his head under my chin as if he'd done it 100 times before. I didn't know then how much this tiny, shivering stranger would change my life. I just knew that I couldn't put him back outside. Not now. Not ever. I carried him to the kitchen, each step careful, as if the whole world had suddenly become fragile glass. The kitchen felt warmer than the rest of the house thanks to the old radiator ticking quietly under the window. I flicked on the light, and golden illumination spilled over the counters, the sink full of last night's dishes, the solitary mug by the coffee maker. The kitten squinted at the brightness, then burrowed deeper into the crook of my arm. "Hold on, little guy," I murmured, placing him gently on a folded dish towel on the table. He sat there, hunched up, his paws tucked under his chest, shivering uncontrollably. When I stepped away to rummage in the cabinet for another, fluffier towel, a tiny panic rose in his eyes. "I'm right here," I said quickly, turning back so he could see me. It was ridiculous, how important it suddenly felt not to let him out of my sight. "I'm not going anywhere." I found a thick, soft towel at the back of the cabinet, one I used when I occasionally remembered I owned a bathtub and brought it over. Slowly, narrating every movement like he could understand the words, I wrapped it around him, leaving only his face and the tips of his ears exposed. He shivered, then relaxed by a fraction. Up close, I could see how young he really was. A kitten, not even fully grown. His whiskers were long and uneven, one of them bent at a funny angle. There was a little notch in his right ear, like a missing puzzle piece. His eyes, for all their fear and brightness, had the cloudy look of someone who hadn't slept properly in a long time. "You're a mess," I said softly, my thumb brushing gently along his damp cheek. "But you're a very brave mess." He blinked slowly, as if considering that. I warmed some milk on the stove, careful not to let it boil. I could feel his gaze on me the whole time, tracking me as I moved from counter to stove to cupboard. Whenever I disappeared behind the fridge door, he gave a small, questioning chirp until I stepped back into view. It hit me, in a quiet, startling way, how used he must be to people leaving. When the milk was warm, I poured it into a shallow dish and placed it on the table in front of him. For a moment, he just stared, blinking. Then his nose twitched. His head dipped. The first lap seemed to surprise him. His eyes widened. Then hunger surged past caution, and he began to drink with a ferocity that made my throat tighten. His entire body shook with the effort, but he didn't stop. He paused only to catch his breath, then kept going, lapping noisily, some of the milk dribbling onto the towel. "Easy," I whispered, placing a hand gently against his side, feeling the rapid flutter of his ribs. "There's more if you want. You don't have to race it." He didn't understand the words, of course, but maybe he understood the tone. His pace slowed just a little. When he finally pulled away, there was a pale white streak on his nose and a drop hanging stubbornly from his chin. He looked faintly bewildered. Then he swayed. "Whoa, hey," I murmured, scooping him up again before he toppled. Wrapped in the towel, warm from the milk and the kitchen air, he felt a little heavier now, a little more present. His shivering had eased from violent tremors to small, occasional shudders. He blinked up at me as I cradled him. Those eyes. God, those eyes were no longer just wide with fear. There was something else there now. Confusion. Curiosity. A tentative question. Is this real? I took him to the living room, where a sagging old couch waited under the window. The sky outside was lightening slowly, streaks of pink trying to push through the clouds. I sat down carefully, keeping him against my chest. He shifted once, twice, then made a soft, determined sound and crawled upward, pressing himself beneath my chin again. He kneaded at the towel with tiny paws, claws barely pricking my skin through the fabric. It was a kitten's instinct, something left over from a time when he'd pushed for milk from a mother who, for whatever reason, wasn't here now. "Okay," I murmured, stroking his back with the lightest of touches. Okay, you can stay. We'll figure it out. He answered with a faint purr. It was more vibration than sound at first, hesitant and shaky. But as I kept stroking him, as the warmth between us grew, the purr deepened. It rolled through his small body like a distant engine, steady and soothing. I didn't realize I was crying until a tear slid off my jaw and landed on his fur. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, startled. I didn't cry. Not anymore. Not after the last 2 years, when every tear had felt like a weakness I couldn't afford. But there, in the half-light of morning, with a tiny stranger trusting me with his life, something inside me loosened. You're going to be okay, I whispered to him, and maybe to myself. I promise. He fell asleep like that, tucked under my chin, his breath warm against my throat. Outside, the storm clouds finally began to break apart, letting narrow beams of sun slip through. They fell across the room, catching dust motes in midair, turning them into tiny floating stars. I watched them drift while the kitten slept, and for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel so heavy. Hours later, after calls to the local shelter to check if anyone had reported a missing kitten, no one had. After a hesitant visit to the nearest pet store for litter and food and a cheap little collar, I watched him explore my living room on wobbly legs. He was still weak, but curiosity had begun to nudge aside fear. He sniffed every corner of the rug, batted clumsily at the tassels on the edge of a throw blanket, and nearly fell over when he tried to chase a sunbeam creeping across the floor. When he walked too far and looked back to find me several feet away, his eyes widened and he froze. It's okay, I said quickly. I'm right here. He stared at me for a few seconds as if measuring the distance, then trotted back, his tiny paws barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. He sat right against my foot, pressing his side into it, and seemed to sigh. You really don't want me out of your sight, huh? I said. A small murp in response. If I'd needed any more confirmation that he'd chosen me, that sound was it. That evening, as rain started again outside, not the harsh, cutting rain of the night before, but a soft, steady curtain. I lit a fire in the old fireplace that hadn't seen much use. The kitten watched every movement with that laser focus cats have, his tail twitching slowly. When the first flames caught and warmth began to spill into the room, he stepped forward cautiously, then lay down on the rug in front of the hearth. He stretched his paws out and rested his chin on them, eyes half closed, as if he'd just discovered the concept of comfort and wasn't quite sure what to do with it. What do I call you? I wondered aloud. He flicked an ear, but didn't look away from the fire. You showed up with the rain, I mused. You look like a little rain cloud on my doorstep. You sound like rain when you purr. His tail gave a tiny, lazy thump against the floor, as if he approved of the poetry. Rain, I said softly, testing it. How about rain? For the first time, he turned his head to look straight at me when I said the word. It was probably coincidence, just reaction to my voice. But it felt like something else, something small and magical. Rain, I said again, smiling before I realized I was doing it. Okay, rain it is. The days that followed settled into a new shape, like a blanket adjusted to cover two instead of one. Rain learned quickly. He learned that the sound of the kettle meant I'd soon be sitting on the couch, which meant lap time. He learned that the rustle of a treat bag was worth sprinting across the room, for though his version of sprint was more of an enthusiastic wobble at first, he learned that the red blinking light on the TV was not, in fact, a laser dot to be hunted. He also learned that thunder was his enemy. The first storm, after he arrived, came 3 days later. One moment, the world outside was ordinary gray. The next, the sky cracked like glass, splitting open with a boom that shook the windows. Rain's reaction was immediate and visceral. He flinched so hard he slid off the back of the armchair he'd been perched on. Before I could even say his name, he launched himself toward me, claws scrabbling on the floor, tail puffed into a ridiculous bottle brush. He collided with my chest as I sat on the couch, clinging to my shirt with all four paws. His heart pounded wildly against my ribs. He tried to burrow inside my arms, as if he believed that if he could just get close enough, the thunder wouldn't find him. Hey, it's okay, I soothed, wrapping my arms around him carefully, mindful of his still fragile frame. Another crash of thunder rolled across the sky, longer this time. Rain flinched again, burying his face in the crook of my elbow. I held him for the entire storm. Every time the sky growled, I murmured reassurances, silly little sentences that didn't mean anything except that I was there and I wasn't letting go. His trembling gradually slowed. The violent tension in his muscles eased. By the time the rain lightened to a gentle patter against the windows, he had fallen asleep in my arms, his paws relaxed, his tail tucked neatly around his body. I didn't move. I sat there, my arms full of warm, sleeping Kitten, and listened to the rain. There was a time not so long ago, though it felt like a different lifetime, when storms like that would have sent me into my own kind of panic. Not because of the noise or the lightning, but because they reminded me of the night everything had changed. Flashing lights, sirens in the rain, the phone call that had split my world into a before and after. For months afterward, I had felt like I was the one left outside someone else's door, soaked and shivering, waiting for an answer that didn't come. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped waiting. I'd stopped expecting anything from anyone. I'd built a small, quiet life around the emptiness, careful and contained. Work, sleep, laundry, dishes, repeat. The house had become a shell where nothing unexpected happened. Until rain. Now, as he breathed softly against my chest, I realized I was no longer alone with the sound of the storm. I had someone to hold, someone who needed me to be calm, to be steady, to be a safe place. The thought was terrifying and strangely beautiful. Rain grew stronger each week. His fur thickened, turning from rough damp patches into a soft, plush grey coat that caught the light in silvery streaks. His eyes lost that constant edge of panic and instead sparkled with mischief and curiosity. His paws, once tentative, became sure and quick. He discovered that the highest point in the living room was the top of the bookshelf, and that he could, with the right amount of determination, get there by using the back of the couch as a launching pad. I discovered, after nearly having a heart attack, that my reflexes were, apparently, still good enough to catch falling ceramic plant pots. He chased dust motes in the sunlight, leaping and twisting in midair with the kind of wild joy that made me laugh out loud. He stalked the red dot of a laser pointer with the seriousness of a lion on the savannah. He ambushed my ankles from behind door frames, then rolled onto his back with theatrical innocence when I yelped. But no matter how bold he became, one thing never changed. He always came back to me. If I was at my desk, he wanted to be on my lap, one paw draped over my wrist while I typed. If I was in the kitchen, he supervised, from the top of the fridge, his tail hanging down like a gray question mark. If I took a shower, he waited outside the bathroom door, occasionally reaching a paw under it to make sure I was still there. At night, he slept pressed against my side. If I turned over, he adjusted too, gravitating back toward me like I was some kind of strange, slightly lumpy planet. His constant presence should have felt suffocating. Instead, it felt like air finally filling lungs that had been half empty for too long. There were still hard days. Days when memories ambushed me. An old photograph slipped out of a book. A familiar song playing unexpectedly on the radio. The scent of a particular kind of soap in the grocery store that sent me spiraling back to a hospital room and a hand growing colder in mine. On those days, I moved more slowly. I forgot to eat. The house seemed to tilt slightly, its corners filled with shadows that used to be people. Rain noticed. He noticed when I sat too long in the same spot, staring at nothing. He noticed when my hands shook as I tried to pour coffee or when my breath came in short, shallow bursts. He didn't understand, not in the way a person would, but he knew something was wrong. On those days, he didn't demand playtime. He didn't try to chase my feet or knock pens off the table for fun. Instead, he climbed into my lap without ceremony, pressed his warm body against my stomach, and purred. It was not a delicate, dainty purr. It was deep and determined, the kind that rattled his whole frame, a grounding sound like a steady engine in a storm. Sometimes, without meaning to, I found myself matching my breathing to the rhythm of that purr. In, out, in, out. The trembling in my hands would fade. The sharp edges of memory would soften just a little. Okay, I'd whisper into his fur. Okay, I'm here. You're here. We're okay. It felt strange talking out loud in an otherwise empty room, but with Rain nestled against me, it didn't feel as foolish as it might have before. He answered with a small, sleepy "Miro," as if agreeing. One particularly bad evening, when the anniversary of the accident arrived like an uninvited guest, I found myself on the floor beside the couch, back against the cool wall, knees drawn up to my chest. The lights were off. The only illumination came from the street lamp outside, filtering through the curtains. Rain came looking for me. I heard him before I saw him. Soft paws on the hardwood, the faint jingle of his collar bell. He appeared in the doorway, a small silhouette framed by the lighter rectangle of the hallway. His eyes glowed faintly in the dimness. He hesitated for a moment as if trying to decide what mood I was in. Then he padded over and sat directly in front of me, so close that his whiskers brushed my knee. He tilted his head, studying my face. "Don't look at me like that," I muttered, my voice rough. "I'm fine." I wasn't fine. Rain didn't seem convinced either. He stood up on his hind legs and placed his front paws against my knee, stretching his body upward. Then, with a slightly clumsy hop, he climbed into my lap, his claws catching on the fabric of my pants for leverage. He turned exactly twice, as if tracing a small circle of intention, then settled down, his back pressed against my chest, his paws resting lightly on my arm. He started to purr. The sound filled the small space between my ribs and the wall, vibrating against my heart. It was so steady, so unwavering, that I felt my own shaky breathing begin to sync with it, whether I wanted it to or not. I buried my face in the soft fur on the top of his head. "Thank you," I whispered, though my voice cracked in the middle of the word. He pushed his head harder against my chin, purring louder. We stayed like that for a long time, the world reduced to shared warmth and quiet sound. At some point, without realizing it, I stopped crying. Later that night, as he slept curled under my arm, I realized something that made my chest ache in a new way. I hadn't rescued Rain. Not really. We had rescued each other. One crisp morning, weeks after the day he'd arrived on my doorstep, I took Rain to the small park at the end of the street. I'd bought a tiny harness and leash more for my own peace of mind than anything. The idea of him slipping away, vanishing into those dangerous streets again, was enough to make my stomach lurch. He protested the harness at first, twisting and flopping dramatically on the floor, as if I'd wrapped him in barbed wire instead of soft nylon. But once we reached the park and a gust of wind brought him the scent of grass, leaves, and distant birds, he forgot all about his indignation. He lifted his head and sniffed the air, eyes wide. We walked slowly along the path, Rain's paws crunching softly on the gravel. He approached everything with cautious fascination. A fallen leaf, a patch of sunlight, an ant hill. He sat and watched a sparrow hop around a bench with the intense concentration of a scientist observing a rare phenomenon. An older woman sat on that bench, feeding the birds with small pieces of bread from a paper bag. She wore a long, faded coat and a knitted hat that had seen better winters. When she spotted Rain, her expression brightened. "Well, aren't you a handsome little cloud?" she said, smiling. "What's his name?" "Rain," I answered, a little shy. I wasn't used to chatting with strangers, but something about Rain's easy curiosity made the world feel less intimidating. Rain, she repeated, as if tasting the word. Fitting. Looks like he came straight from the sky. In a way he did, I said. She watched me for a moment, eyes gentle but sharp. You found him? He found me, I corrected quietly. On my doorstep. Ah, she said knowingly. They do that, you know. They show up right when you need them. I smiled faintly. That's what people keep saying. They're right. She tossed another handful of crumbs to the birds, who hopped closer. I was very sick a few years ago. Thought I might not make it. Then this scruffy ginger tomcat started sleeping on my windowsill. No matter how bad I felt, he was always there. Came with the dawn, left with the dark. I started waking up just to see him. What happened to him? I asked. She smiled. I opened the window. We walked on after that, Rain occasionally tangling himself in the leash in his eagerness to investigate something new. The woman's words stayed with me, though, circling in my mind like leaves caught in a quiet whirlwind. I thought about the front door, about the cold blue dawn, about the tiny, shivering bundle of fur that had chosen my house to collapse in front of, out of all the doors on the street. Maybe it was random. Maybe it wasn't. Rain tired quickly from his grand outdoor adventure. On the way home, he walked closer to my ankle, his tail drooping, but his eyes still bright. By the time we crossed the threshold of the house, he was moving on instinct alone, following my scent, my footsteps. As soon as I unclipped the harness, he made a beeline for the couch and flopped onto his side with a very dramatic sigh. I laughed, the sound startlingly light in my own ears. Long day, huh? I teased, sitting beside him. He rolled onto his back and blinked at me upside down, his paws tucked to his chest. I rubbed his belly gently, and he stretched out, surrendering completely. Later that evening, as sunlight streamed low through the windows and turned the living room gold, Rain jumped onto the windowsill and watched the world outside with the satisfied air of someone who had been there and decided home was better. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. Slightly bigger now, fur thicker, posture more confident. My reflection hovered behind his, faint but there. We looked like we belonged in the same frame. He was shivering on my doorstep alone, I thought, remembering that first moment. Now he sat tall and warm, outlined in light, a small king surveying his new kingdom. I walked over and stood beside the window. Rain glanced up at me. Without looking away from the view, he bumped his head lightly against my hand. I rested my fingers on his back. We watched the sky darken together, the first stars appearing faintly above the trees. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, low and far away, more memory than threat. Rain's ears twitched at the sound. He stiffened for just a second, then relaxed when my hand gently scratched behind his neck. You're not out there anymore, I murmured. You're here. With me. He leaned into my touch, purring softly. Maybe I would always flinch a little at the sound of distant sirens on wet roads. Maybe he would always tighten his paws when thunder rolled. Some scars never fully disappeared. But as night settled around the house like a soft blanket, warm light spilling onto the floor, I realized that the emptiness that had once swallowed every room had changed. It wasn't gone exactly. Loss didn't just evaporate, but it had been joined by something new. Small paws on hardwood, a bell's jingle in the dark, a warm weight curling against my side at the end of the day. I had opened the door once on a rainy morning, thinking I was letting in a stray kitten. I hadn't known I was letting in a second chance. Rain yawned, a tiny, squeaky sound, and pushed his head further under my hand. We're going to be okay, I told him softly. He purred, like a promise answering a promise. Outside, the first raindrops began to fall, tapping gently against the glass. Not a storm this time, just a quiet, steady rain, washing the world clean. Inside, a little grey cat and a once broken heart sat together at the window, no longer shivering, no longer alone.